Well, for more on China and Hollywood, I spoke to Tim Mulligan. He's the research director and senior analyst at MIDiA Research. I started by asking him about the impact of new regulations from both sides.
Whilst we have this big macro picture of increasing friction between the two foremost global powers, on the cultural level, there's an increasing sense of symbiotic relationship. So partly this is down to the need for the Chinese domestic market to ramp up its content offerings. The Chinese market is the fastest growing film and streaming video market globally. But also it's a recognition that for the Hollywood, China represents the fastest growing market for them to expand into. So one of the challenges which the US, the 7 major US studios have is how to get enough content into the Chinese market because of the need to work with the state regulator for distributions. So one of the most notable players in Chinese investments into the US film industry has been Dalian Wanda. If you look at the acquisition which they made of Legendary Pictures, they've seen nearly an 11% return on their investment, their $3.5 billion investment. You look at the $800 million in revenue that unit has generated in the last 2 years, and of course being behind such big successes as the latest installment of the Jurassic World franchise.
So what would be your advice then, Tim, to companies in dealing with this new landscape? What's the best way to go?
You cannot have decisions in a business context made in a vacuum. There needs to be a recognition that the wider, broader landscape is changing. And there needs to be, from a non-Chinese perspective, there needs to be a greater sensitivity towards the needs and demands of the Chinese domestic market, not just from the regulatory framework, but also from the consumption perspective as well.
Yeah, what would you advise people to be aware of in that respect? I mean, I guess you're really getting to the heart of what the differences are in terms of what a Chinese movie consumer wants as opposed to an American one.
Yes, absolutely. So perhaps regrettably, to date, the majority of joint ventures between Hollywood studios and Chinese financing have resolved purely around making an international film, having some kind of Chinese component to justify the Chinese investment. Right. Well, really, what we need are Chinese-centric films. So films that specifically tell the use case of the Chinese perspective on how China is in this remarkable stage in their cultural awakening, where they have a wealth of stories of their own, with their own nuances, with a non-global perspective, and particularly a non-US perspective.
And there's plenty of cultural stories and metaphors and fables to draw on, but I want to just bring you to Fan Bingbing. We've been covering the story of tax evasion issues. Is it your sense that there's going to be any impact on film investment from what's going on there, or are they two separate situations?
If this was any other market, if it was any other story around the film industry, then it would be a simple case of someone who has been called up for not paying the taxes which they're owed for the society that they're residing in and operating in. From the perspective of outside investors wanting to invest in content, now they have to be aware that there are these quota limits. So there's a 40% cap on budgets which can be spent on acting talent now. That's just recently come into place. And within that 40%, only 70% can be allocated for the leading actors in those productions. So that inevitably is going to have some dampening impact upon not just the kind of talent that they're able to attract, but the way that those films are increasingly produced around tier one talent. So we will see an increasing divergence from the Hollywood model, which is still primarily driven by the leading lady or the leading man dynamics, where you pay a competitive high price to get people you know will be able to make sure that you have the highest chance of getting return on your investment at the box office.